test things by, to be part of that larger group of humanity. The classics do withstand the passage of time. Now, Tom Kiemer is one of the authors I looked at for this book, and he compares Emma to Edmund Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France. Quote, "Her novels locate moral value and communal harmony in the established traditions and time-honored institutions of a hierarchical, patriarchal social order. Those are somewhat foreign terms to Americans. Again, we like to think, we pretend we're egalitarian, everybody's the same. I don't believe we're going to go back to hierarchy and patriarchy. Probably shouldn't. But there was a stability, a certainness of position that we don't have anymore. Edmund Burke argued that our full human community includes the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. And decisions in politics, culture, and other matters should consider that whole range of the family, the dead, the living, and those to be born. We have obligations to those who come after us, and we ought to pay a little attention to those who came before us. See what went wrong and maybe copy what went right. To focus only on the present makes us orphans in history. That's not a good place to be. Much of our current political and cultural turmoil results from lacking a frame of reference. I remember again and again in teaching, asking kiddos about key events. Which half of the 19th century did the Civil War occur? Well, some of them thought it was the first half, and some of them thought it was the 18th century. That was a little bit on the disappointing side. Now then, for example, we're concerned in various degrees about this COVID business. How many of us read the fiction about plagues and diseases in the past? Sigrid Undset, one of the first women to win the Nobel Prize, wrote a fine trilogy, Kristin Lavransdatter, which deals with Norway. I had no idea that 13th century or 14th century Norway could be so fascinating, with rich, deep relationships. And that novel ends with Kristin dying of a Black Death. It was something they knew was there and had lived with and just. Alessandro Manzoni's The Betrothed is a very long novel set in Italy, and it also deals with the Black Death and the terror and how people ran from it, but more importantly, they overcame and survived. It's not that it's going to give us answers on how to handle current problems, but to know we're not alone. This is not unique in human history. And also, if any of you are fond of Texas literature, Horton Foote wrote a fine drama called 1918 about the Spanish flu, which killed lots of folks in Texas. Don't want to spend much time on that, but unlike what we're facing now, young people, 20, 25, could be healthy at breakfast and dead at supper. That's an entirely different level than we're facing now. And also World War I is going on. So again, we can have a broader and deeper understanding of life by reading these fine novels and history as well. Wayne Booth wrote a fine book called The Ethics in Fiction, says we should choose our books much as we choose our friends. We want a friend to be helpful, kind, cheerful, understanding, dependable, honest, but above all, I believe most of us want to trust the friend. And a book can be much the same. It can be playful, satirical, ironic, but can we trust the author to speak the truth? That's a key test. I believe Jane Austen passes that test with flying colors. George Knightley treats Emma Woodhouse in this way, especially after the picnic on Box Hill. Were you planning to go to that picnic? Or you have more to say? Or if you want to, I can skip it.
Do whatever you want to do.
Well, I'll just briefly read, assuming with these microphone and a book and notes, it's almost too much to keep up with. Emma, I must once more speak to you as I have been used to do, a privilege rather endured than allowed, perhaps, but I must still use it. I cannot see you acting wrong without a remonstrance. How could you be so unfeeling to Miss Bates? How could you be so insolent in your wit to a woman of her character, age, and situation? Emma, I thought it impossible. And then I assure you, Emma comes back and says, I dare say she did not understand me, and Knightley straightens her out. I assure you she did. She felt your full meaning. She has talked of it since. I wish you could have heard how she talked of it. So Knightley is that good friend, much as a book can be. And again, a rare quality in our time. Jane Austen is trustworthy, showing us much of what we need to know and what we might enjoy. Which takes us back to the Greeks. Their idea of literature, which would be poetry and drama, no fiction yet, is that literature should instruct and delight. A different standard than we have now. Fay Weldon, another contemporary British novelist, copies Austen in some respects in this book, Letters to Alice, on first reading Jane Austen. It is epistolary, fancy way of reading a bunch of letters. And she says in there, quote, readers need and seek for moral guidance. I mean this in the best and even unconventional sense. They need an example in the light in which they can examine themselves, understand themselves. It also reminds me of one of the few good books I had in those lit criticism classes ages ago at KU, M.H. Abrams' The Mirror and the Lamp. Similarly advises us about fiction. Fiction sometimes is a lamp lighting the darkness to show us what we didn't understand, and we're better off in the experience. And sometimes it is not a light into the darkness, it is a mirror. We see ourselves. One of the best examples of this, if you're familiar with the books of the Old Testament, Nathan's parable to King David after the adultery of Bathsheba, about a rich man had all kinds of sheep. He went to his impoverished neighbor, stole the poor man's sheep, and cooked it for his guest. David was furious. He ought to repay, and Nathan nailed him. And King James Version is, "Thou art the man." That time, literature was a mirror. Unlike most kings, David was sorry and repented. In the other king was simply cut off the head of the prophet and done with it. Well, Derisovits's Jane Austen illustrates this. If you have the time and interest, he did learn a lot about how to avoid being a smart aleck and a whiny little twit from Jane Austen. That would be worth your reading if you care much about it. Now, our expectations influence often govern our outcomes. Emma is not an action-driven story. If you're thinking about reading it, you need to have some useful expectations. Austen superbly develops ordinary characters and context in great detail. These are ordinary characters. They are not generals and military heroes and superheroes. Ordinary folks, middle class, and we see them in lots and lots of discussions. They move around a great deal, and we get to know them very well in one setting. If you understand that you're going to have about 400 pages of that, it is very rewarding. If you're looking for adventure, well, try a thriller or something like that. Okay. Now, later realism also developed ordinary characters, but went in a different direction. Theodore Dreiser's Carrie talked about showed us a woman who was willing to sleep around and invent herself financially. Stephen Crane's Maggie was a shocking novel about prostitution. So those are some changes that followed Austen. Austen's world is different. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. It's one of the famous lines about history books. Just briefly about the age in which she lived, I've already mentioned the American Revolution. In 1776, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, the greatest of all economics books. In 1789, the French Revolution occurred and was followed by the Reign of Terror in 1793. Edmund Burke, the father of conservatism, wrote reflections on the Revolution in France. Thomas Paine, remember The American Cause and Common Sense? Over in Europe, he was a different character altogether, and he reacted against the conservative Burke by writing The Age of Reason. There was a lot of intellectual and political and cultural turmoil going on in Austin's world. Napoleon replaces the failed French Revolution with a dictatorship, and he advanced throughout Europe. His army seemed invincible. However, another great piece of literature shows what happens with arrogance and failure to plan ahead. Napoleon forgot to allow for the Russian winter. He lost 90% of his troops. He fled in a particular wagon, got out of there safely. He left 90% of his troops to the Russians and the wolves. And one of the great novels of all time, Tolstoy's War and Peace, is resulting from that period. In England, William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect closed slavery until 1833. The Industrial Revolution brought increased wealth and impoverished the rural workers relocated to the slums. This is a time starting to develop more turmoil. It's not just everything was nice and quiet. Now, Austin's settings are nice and quiet, not much turmoil. But that's part of the background that's going on. Faye Weldon said something that got my attention 30-some years ago, the first time I read the book. She asserts that at the time of Jane Austen, 1/8 of the women in London were prostitutes. Not that they were sluts out to have a good time, desperately hungry. And they thought either earn money that way or starve. It's a difficult time in which to be living. Okay, in the early 19th century literature in the U.S., most homes, if they had books, would have a King James Bible. Some or all of Shakespeare, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and perhaps John Milton. There was a core, a common frame of reference there. Now, Austen satirized Gothic fiction, particularly Northanger Abbey. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, read the book. It's all these strange hallways and presumed murders and whatnot, and vicious people, and Austen ridicules those. The novelists she would have known about include Daniel Defoe, Richardson, and Fielding. There were also some women writing: Frances Burney, Mary Wollstonecraft, Hannah More, and Maria Edgeworth. Now, unlike now, stories and novels were often read aloud to an audience. I think you mentioned what people do at night. It was not so unusual for someone with a good speaking voice, unlike mine, to gather 10, 20, 30 people in a room and dramatically read 2 or 4 chapters of a novel. And folks learned to read that way. We thought we'd accomplish something with our audio books and whatnot plugged into our ears. Some authors wrote for that context. It might seem strange to us, but later in the 19th century, many Americans knew the day that the next installment of Dickens' novel would arrive, and they would be at the docks to meet the ship. So Americans were probably more literate than now. We talk about Americans being literate. We can process information, yes. Knowing and loving stories, I'd say 19th century much more literate than we are. Well, there were mixed reviews from other novelists. I've already mentioned that Sir Walter Scott praised her work. I think, though, we probably should look at Mark Twain. He had an opinion about Jane. Whoops,
My copy.
yeah, I thought so. I don't remember putting tabs in my book. Okay. This is what Mark Twain said. Austen made him feel like a barkeep entering the kingdom of heaven. It seems a great pity to me that they allowed her to die a natural death. Every time I read Pride and Prejudice, I want to dig her up and hit her over the skull with her own shin bone. So Twain was not a fan. Now, if any of you enjoy Western literature, you might want to read Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, where he goes after Sir Walter Scott and James Fenimore Cooper. Oddly, Rudyard Kipling liked Austen, and many World War I British troops loved her novels and found it a refreshing break from all the mud and the blood and the suffering. Enjoyed it a great deal. G.K. Chesterton rated her characterization talent above those of George Eliot and Charlotte Bronte. Quote, she could coolly and sensibly describe a man. And that is a great challenge for a writer, for a man to imagine a woman's mind and what she's thinking, and for the female author to imagine what's going on in a woman's mind. Those that can pull it off. The rest of us think about it. I guess that's one reason I get to read the first novel. Morality is not now a popular topic for us, but other centuries accepted it, even demanded it. In our own time, there's often the phrase, don't impose your morals on me. Do you realize that statement is itself a moral statement? It's self-conflicted. When I was teaching the Institute, I'm not a fan of gadgets. And sometimes I'd come along and say, you know, you're not doing well in class. I think you're wasting your time on this laptop. I'm going to take it. What? You can't. You want to bet? I'm bigger. I'm meaner. I lift weights. It's the word of adult against the word of kid. What do you mean I can't take it? But. What do you mean, but? I don't like it. I didn't ask about your emotional situation. I think I'll go ahead and take it. But. Young man, do you have anything else to say on the subject? Did it occur to you there's a thing called rights, and privileges, and responsibility? Why do you not think about rights? You tell me about your feelings. We'll never get anywhere on that. Most cadets were great. I loved working with them. But it's odd. They could not really explain right and wrong. I think we're starting to feel the pressure on the time. I'm going to skip through part of this about Frank and Mr. Elton. Emma has a problem meddling or managing others. Perhaps that's amusing to us, but it's a moral failing. She's slow to recognize her faults. Are we any better? That is worth thinking about. Emma presumes to be a reformer. Reforming herself is nobler and more probable, but reforming others is a whole lot more fun. Now, there are similar tales. George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, based on the Greek myth about reshaping the woman into what a man wants. And one of my favorites is the musical Oleron Lowe's My Fair Lady, where Professor Higgins lifts Liza from the gutter, turns her into an elegant, charming lady, and then is ready to pitch her back to the gutter. But being a musical, they do marry. That's the thing that happens in the comedy. Well, I think I'll skip over some of the others.
Yeah, I do want to have time to talk about it.
Right.
I'll let them talk about it.
And I think that is, why read Emma and other Austen novels? She spends much time acquainting us with some appealing characters, deeply rooted in true communities. We need the reminder that our frantic, anxious pace of life is scarcely the only way to live. Hers is a friendship worth cultivating.
Thank you. Who here read the book? Okay, and did anybody watch who did not read the book, watch a movie? So you got the story that way. Okay, the only person were you the only one that didn't read you hadn't gotten the story at all? Do I need, no, I'm looking at Barbara over here, over your shoulder. this would come back on. There we go. Okay. So I want to, do you need a recap, or do you think you've kind of picked it up from what everybody's been talking about, Barbara? Because I can't do a quick recap, but we are running short on time.
How long is your recap?
It's like about half a page, but
I'd say do it.
you'd say do it, huh?
I would.
Well, you're the boss, I guess. I do just want to say that Jane Austen, okay, so I do have some discussion questions. Her favorite thing is 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. And, which is what she does in Emma for sure, really all of her books. And Emma was the first of Austen's books to be published in the U.S. in 1816 in Philadelphia. Okay, the quick recap is the title character, Emma Woodhouse, is queen of her little community. And Barbara, this is for you. She is lovely and wealthy. Her fussy, fragile father imposes no curbs either on her behavior or her self-satisfaction. Everyone else in the village is deferentially lower in social standing. Only Mr. Knightley, a longtime family friend, ever suggests she needs improvement. Emma is bored with Highbury. Do you think that's part of her problem? She decides she has a talent for matchmaking, and she starts meddling. And she tries to set up pretty Harriet Smith with somebody. That doesn't work because she tries to raise her too far. So I'm going to jump to the end. The couples are eventually sorted out, if not according to Emma's plan, at least to her satisfaction. Uninterested in marriage at the book's beginning, she happily engages herself to Mr. Knightley before its end. So now you're going to know the ending, if you do want to read it later. Okay, I sent out a challenge. Who got it? No, it's not the last chapter.
It's chapter 5 and volume 3.
It's chapter 5. Well, it's part 3, chapter 5, correct. And whose point of view is it? Anybody else? Okay, Diane, whose point of view is it from?
Basically, Mr.
It's from Mr. Knightley's point of view. So he got one chapter from his head, from the way we're seeing it, compared to everything else being more about Emma. I mean, it was about both of them, but... So here's Emma, and Jane Austen says nobody's going to like her much. So what I want to know is, do you like Emma? You do not.
She's so smart.
She's so smug. Anybody else? Linda, did you like Emma?
Didn't like her or dislike
Neutral.
She's very well meaning. I didn't like
You did not like her. Okay.
her. She's well meaning. Her intentions are good. Her results are not very good.
Her results are not good. Yeah?
I didn't like her because she was meddling.
She was meddling. And she was sort of meddling out of boredom, I think. You know, she was described as lacking steadiness. What showed us that? She didn't stick with anything. She could play the piano, okay, but she wouldn't work hard enough to get good at it. Same thing with her art. Same thing with her, she'd make these books lists she's going to read, but does she read them? Well, not past the first chapter. So she doesn't keep at things. And the real dangers, it says for Emma, are the power of having rather too much her own way and a little disposition to think too well of herself. But I did put this other picture here on the side. Who's she with over here? Now you gotta give somebody credit who will take as good care of their father as she does, right? And as LaDonna said, she was, even in her meddling, she thought she was looking out for Harriet. She was looking at it wrong, but but when it came to how she felt about Miss Bates, how'd you like her?
Don't you think that's a reflection of the time in which she lived? I mean, this is a woman of power, as you mentioned, she's the queen of her community, and Miss Bates is not, and has no opportunity. And so for her to be unkind to her is not out of character. It is not extraordinary because of her position compared to the other women's position. Is it likable? The answer is no.
Right.
But I think in terms of, Elizabeth, your probability, it is certainly probable to think that Emma would do that sort of thing, because that's who she has been, it's how she's been raised. And so what happens to her, thank goodness, is she matures, and then she changes considerably.
After hearing what I told you about Jane Austen earlier, what character in this book do you think fits her living situation the most? Well, no, Emma's rich. Jane Austen was never rich.
Jane Fairfax?
Pure governance.
Is she like Harriet?
I would say she's like Miss Bates, not in the sense of talking all the time, but in the sense that she lives with her widowed mother, who is widowed from the earlier reverend. So as a reverend, you have a house supplied to you, but you don't own it, so then when you're no longer, you have to move out and they're trying to rent, they're trying to make their money stretch. And I think as far as her situation, she was in the position of Miss Bates, which is sad to me to think about. But some of her, there were other quotes I didn't use where she talked about knowing that somebody wouldn't pay her much attention because they were of a wealthier situation. So that's kind of sad. One of the things I did like about Emma also, there's a scene early in the book where Emma's sister and her family come to visit, and after dinner there's these different conversations going on, and Mr. Wentworth is saying, oh, don't take the kids to the beach, and then they start disagreeing over their different apothecaries, and Emma is right there trying to keep the conversation, trying to keep people from arguing, trying to keep the brother-in-law from getting crossways with her father. And I thought, boy, she is working hard to keep things going. She was writing in contrast to Gothic novels, as was mentioned, and she makes an unusual choice in this book because she does concentrate on Emma, who had little to distress or vex her.
I'm meddling.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's always... and the Jane Fairfax storyline, if you think about it, it had a secret engagement, it had all different kinds of problems. So what do you think about that? I mean, would you rather been reading about Jane? No? So you think she chose the right person to tell the story of? Well, I know personally, I was wanting to hear some of the conversations between Jane and Frank, especially when he messed up by flirting with Emma, and Jane, you know Jane's mad, but you don't really get to hear that argument or what happens. So I think sometimes I would have liked to hear a little bit more of that. Okay.
It would have been interesting to find out how she came to be secretly engaged.
Right. How did that happen?
That's a 21st century perspective, but you need the background.
Yeah. Because they weren't of really the same class. She didn't have the money that he had, or other women he might have been meeting had. Like Mr. Elton went for the woman he could get some money from. Okay. Was there anything you What you? Geraldine, you didn't say anything funny.
I did not like Emma.
You didn't like Emma.
I mean, it was the book, I mean, tell me why I like Pride and Prejudice more than Emma. 'Cause Emma left me kind of like, ugh.
Well, Pride and Prejudice is my favorite book, your favorite book, and it's been her favorite book. The critics feel like Emma is a more full, well-written story. It's her masterpiece. But I'm like you. Pride and Prejudice is lighter. There's not quite as much
You know, this is
detail
stupid.
in it.
This is
Uh-huh.
stupid, but you know, Emma reminded me of, and really stupid. Anybody watch The Big Bang Theory? Emma reminded me of Sheldon.
Sheldon.
You know, I mean, not all the time, but a lot of times. She's looked like she's right, and I don't care, I'll do this, and blah, blah, and that's Emma. I think that's why I want to slap her. Maybe
Well, I'm glad we had strong feelings, because that's
I
important.
didn't find very funny.
Richard?
I found the minister both comical and irritating.
Oh, Mr. Elton, Reverend.
That's good.
Yeah, he was. Well, there was a lot of little places I thought were funny.
Well, I thought his wife was funny at times because she was kind of a little more of a caricature of somebody who has a great opinion.
Elton's wife.
Elton's wife, yes, and can't keep her mouth shut about herself and what she thinks and what others.
Yeah. So I think Jane was trying to put humor in here. She also did it, though, in a very realistic way. One place I found funny is when they are going in to check out this place where they want to have the dance. And will you read the man's part here in a minute, Richard? So they go in, Miss Weston says, Emma, this paper is worse than I expected. Look, in places you can see it is dreadfully dirty, and the wainscot is more yellow and forlorn than I could have imagined. I don't know if you heard me. Richard, could you read that?
My dear, you are too particular. You will see nothing of it by candlelight. We never see anything of it in our club nights.
Yeah, of course you don't. The ladies have here probably, and this is straight out of her book, the ladies here probably exchanged looks, which meant men never know when things are dirty or not. And the gentlemen perhaps thought women will have their little nonsenses and needless cares. So she's really describing people so realistically, and yet you see the humor in it. Okay, so early in the book, Emma tells Harriet she doesn't plan to marry. She's not interested in that. She doesn't need to. But the other women all embody, in one way or another, the serious economic consequences of staying single. The book is filled with women at risk. And then these are questions that I borrowed from an online Jane Austen thing. So they wanted to discuss these. We need to go through these quickly. But here's Miss Taylor, who Mr. Wentworth always kept calling her Miss Taylor. But she was really Mrs. Weston. And here she is breaking the news to Emma while she does her mending. But what happened to her? How did finances determine things for her? Mrs. Weston. What choice she made? I mean, poor Miss Taylor. Oh, she just so sad that she got married. That's from Mr. Wentworth's point of view. But what, LaDonna?
Well, she marries well.
She manages to leave. Remember how Jane Austen was dreading the idea of being a governess? And Jane Fairfax. And Jane Austen did not want to be a governess. And the Bronte sisters, who were also daughters of a minister who wrote a little later than Jane Austen, but some of them worked as governesses, and it was terrible. So poor Miss Taylor managed to marry somebody, move into her own home, even becomes a mother. So she got past it, but the finances were a big issue, or she wouldn't have been a governess to start with. Okay, now this is when Harriet runs into Mr. Martin and his sister in the store, the shop. Oh, so what about Miss Harriet? What about Miss Smith? What's her outlook? Dismal, if she doesn't marry. She's not even educated enough to be a governess. She'd have to be a maid or something if she were, needed to work. Right now, she's a paid boarder, being paid for by, they think her father, but nobody knows who that is. Oh, there's that Miss Elton you were talking about. There's one singer at the dance, she's standing there and I can see very few pearls in the room except mine. Now she was financially comfortable, and what did that get? She had a dowry. And what did that get her? It got her a husband, as obnoxious as he was, but it suited her anyway, I think. And this is Jane Fairfax, and this is a scene that we really don't see. We just hear it mentioned in the letter Frank writes at the end about, and it's after the strawberries were picked at Mr. Knightley's, and Frank's late getting there, and Jane Fairfax is left early. And they meet on the road. We don't know that at the time, but we hear about it later. And she says, no, I'm not going to, you're not going to walk with me. She's mad at him. We do know that much what happened between them. But what's her outlook? She's going to have to be a governess, a job which she does not want, except that luckily she does get engaged. And as Mr. Knightley points out, it was very convenient that the aunt then died, that Frank's aunt died, so they could then go ahead with this engagement. Otherwise, she might have had to go ahead and take that job. And here's Miss Bates. And as was pointed out, Mr. Knightley really lets Emma have it about how she spoke to him. And in this book, I'm losing it. Okay. And this was another quote about Miss Bates. And the way Austen introduced her. Her youth had passed without distinction, and her middle of life was devoted to the care of a failing mother and the endeavor to make a small income go as far as possible. And yet she was a happy woman. She loved everybody, was interested in everybody's happiness, quick-sighted to everybody's merits, thought herself a most fortunate creature and surrounded with blessings. Whereas Emma, who has everything, is kind of bored and snitty and snarky. I will say you can kind of see, though, sometimes why Emma does get a little irritated with her. And I know you're not going to be able to read this, the print's too small, but this is one of the times that she walks in to this party, and this went on, just like this. Just nonstop, from one thing to the next, with not room for anybody else to say anything, going from person to person, and just blah, 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 blah. So you can kind of see why Emma would say, well, you can only say 3 things. But at the same time, that's not the way she should have been treated. So she is more worthy of admiration for how she's living her life. There is a point where Emma stops and thinks a minute, and this is when Frank has gotten, and Frank's an interesting name. You know, when we think of the word Frank, this man's a frank person. What's it mean? Open. How open was Frank? Not very. But But he's gotten word that the aunt is sick. He's got to rush back to Richmond. His horse is sick, so he has to get one from the other place, and he's going to all these troubles to get back. And that's the same time that Jane Fairfax is accepting this position she doesn't want. So Emma ponders the contrast between Mrs. Churchill's importance in the world and Jane Fairfax's struck her. One was everything, the other nothing. And she sat musing on the difference of women's destiny. And I think most of the time Jane Austen is just letting things happen, and through what happens, she's giving her lesson. But I thought of that particular quote, she's really making a comment about women. So the men, what about Mr. Woodhouse? What do you think about him? I was saying Wentworth a minute ago, it was Woodhouse. I was calling the wrong name.
It was a little bit of a caricature.
Oh, you thought he was a caricature too?
Yeah, well, he's a fussy old man who ran his way his whole life.
Okay, that's what I was going to wait for somebody to say. He came across as an invalid, but he was fond of society in his own way. He liked very much to have his friends come and see him. From his long residence at Hartford and his good nature, from his fortune, his house, and his daughter, he could command the visits of his own little circle. He had not much intercourse with families beyond that circle, but such as would visit him on his own terms. Like Frank Sinatra says, doing it my way. He seemed invalid and weak, but he pretty much controlled things from that weakness, which wasn't, I guess, maybe so weak. But like Miss Bates, he has a good side. He's looking out for people. He has some nice things that he says to Jane Fairfax. Keep getting the wrong one here. Okay, Mr. Weston. Anybody have anything to say about Mr. Weston? I'm sorry?
I liked it.
He was a nice guy, maybe a little loose-lipped, pretty optimistic. What about Frank Churchill? Didn't like him. He wasn't very frank, was he? He had advantages of money, but not as well taught the class rules. So he didn't stay and in his lane, so to speak, like Mr. Knightley. But he's still young. You know, he's only 2 years older than Emma. So as we're watching Emma grow, hopefully Frank is growing. There is the letter at the end where he makes some acknowledgement of issues. And what about Mr. Knightley? Yeah, almost as good as Mr. Darcy.
Emma doesn't deserve
Emma doesn't deserve him. That may be. He's a well-bred of the gentle class, though he does work as a state. Now, you know, Mr. Darcy, in that book, you never see that he's ever even working. He's just a man of leisure. But you do see Mr. Knightley working. He's also not a snob towards those who are worse off than him. And he's the only person willing to do what to Emma? Put her in her place. Yeah.
He's almost fatherly.
I'm sorry?
He's almost fatherly in his relationship to
Yeah,
Emma.
it is.
And he's 15 years older, so you can see how they kind of got into that. But hopefully that'll change. So class issues run through every plot line, and that was mentioned over here. Harry Smith is the natural daughter of nobody knows whom. Do you think her illegitimacy or her undetermined class standing is more important as far as her marital prospects?
At that time, definitely that time.
Which
Her illegitimately, or I'm not understanding where she's been in the class.
yeah.
Really, back then, if she didn't have money, it just,
Yeah.
didn't chance.
Anybody else? I thought of the two things that maybe the class, undetermined class, was more important. I don't know for sure. I'm not saying that is necessarily true statement, I'm just giving that as an opinion. There are situations where there were natural daughters or natural sons who were acknowledged by their parent and given money, and they managed to do better than she did. So I think the fact that we didn't know what her class was really hurt. Unless at the end of the book we find out that she's the daughter of a tradesman, so she's staying in the class where she fit and came from in the first place.
Now, I bet you this is an economic novel. There's a lot of economics in this novel, and all based on class level and income.
Yeah.
That, to me, that's why it's definitely, in her case, the situation of after class. They don't know who she is, and so she becomes, in that case, at the lowest level of the economic system.
So what do you think about Emma's hopes? You think
That was,
about her hope to move Harriet up? What do you think?
sometimes I would get the feeling that she was doing all this just to, kind of not so nice, that she was doing it because kind of, I'm better than you, kind of paternalistic, but she's supposed to not go. Yeah, but she's very manipulative of Harriet.
Did you notice until the very end, Emma calls Harriet Harriet, and Harriet calls Emma Miss Woodhouse. Now the narrator is putting Emma in there, so it's not that noticeable, but I noticed at the very end, when they're having one of their final conversations, she's still saying Miss Woodhouse. So they were never equals. You think of friends as being equals. They were never equals. She was kind of playing with her. And by the end of the book, she's saying what? I wish I never saw her. She says, I wish I never saw her. So she's really ready to be done with her. One of the critics says that the book improves on rereading. Now, I don't know if anybody wants to sit down and reread it. But I will say, I read it many years ago, haven't read it recently, reread it for this. Also watched 3 versions of the movie over the last few weeks. And getting the story really set in my mind, then as I did read it through this time, I could pick up on where Frank, you would have gotten the clues of what he was doing that I didn't pick up without having that foreknowledge. And kind of seeing Emma and Mr. Knightley's feelings change. And you can pick up things that you didn't see before in rereading. I don't know that anybody's going to do that, but do you like a book in which the writer's intentions are not always clear?
Makes it harder to read. Yeah.
You think it makes it harder to read?
I do think that, because you stall out thinking, what did I lose here?
Okay. Well, I do like a little surprise, though. Some stories, you know those Hallmark movies, and the girl and the guy have a fight at the beginning, and you say, okay, I know who she's going to end up with. I don't want it to be that obvious.
So that's one of the reasons I stuck with the book, is because I really wasn't enjoying it. I felt like I was watching a soap opera. And I thought there's better use of my time than reading this book. I mean, because a lot of the book is same old, same old, same old. But I did kind of want to know how it turns out.
There is a lot of same old, same old, same old. And I'll have to admit, I kept falling asleep. I wake up, read the same paragraph again, and, But yeah, I can see that.
I don't think the writer's intentions matter much if it's written.
There you go, that's the right answer.
If it's engaging, I don't care where the writer thinks he's going. I just care where the story's going.
Along for the ride and hope it's a good ride.
Yeah, right.
And some of the critics said that there was no plot moving back to the story. It was just writers of a community, and things are pretty out without a plot.
Okay. Even they said that even her publisher said not enough happens in it. So
Really, real and true to the period, that's exactly as much as actually happens in order to to advance the storylines of everybody's life.
Especially in a small community like that.
And what they had to do was go visit each other.
Mhm.
And in between, talk when the other people weren't in the room, which we consider gossip, that's not okay. And then flatter each other when they were in the room, which we consider is insincere and not okay.
Well, and pass around these letters. Did you think it was strange that she carried the letter around and said, "Do you want to read Jane's letter? Do you want to read Frank's letter?"
They had so
You know,
little to read.
that's not how we would do things now. When she talks about that her sister lives 16 miles away, you know, to us, that'd be no distance. Plus the phones, you know, it was a different lifestyle, is what you're saying, and I agree with you.
Reveal an inner life, let you try to see the inner life. But you had to see it through what you could observe in the drawing room or what you could observe somewhere else, and then occasionally somebody trying to think for themselves. I don't know.
So Emma and Mr. Knightley do manage to be open with each other, finally, telling their real feelings, and they get a happy ending, but what else has to happen before the marriage can go forward?
Father or dad.
Have to take care of the father. Worry about the father.
So there's still a question, will she marry him? Except Mr. Knightley says, well, I'll come live in your house and help you take care of your father. Wow. Yeah, really. So that was something. Anybody else have any comments they want to make about this? Yes,
You
ma'am.
were saying which person was most like Emma, or I forget how you phrased it, but what I thought they had in common after you showed those snarky comments that Jane Austen had made, I could picture them coming out of that Emma's mouth.
That's true. I agree with that. I think some of that, the way she has Emma say some of the things about Miss Bates and things, I think are exactly the kind of things Jane Austen would have had in her head. Yeah. So not just Miss Bates, but financially speaking, and that. So I'm going to read just the closing words, and this is how the book ends. The wedding was very much like other weddings, where the parties have no taste for finery or parade. The wishes, the hope,